so idealistic. I thought that we would change the world.
He's 5'2" and he's 6'4". He fights with missiles and with spears. He's all of 31 and he's only 17. He's been a soldier for 1,000 years. He's a Catholic, a Hindu, an atheist, a Jain, a Buddhist and a Baptist and a Jew. And he knows he shouldn't kill, and he knows he always will kill you for me, my friend, and me for you. And he's fighting for Canada, he's fighting for France, he's fighting for the USA. And he's fighting for the Russians, and he's fighting for Japan. And he thinks we'll put an end to war this way.
The Vietnam War was a controversial struggle. Tempers ran high on both sides of the issue. Supporters of the war believed that the soldiers were defending America's liberties from communist foes. Those against the conflict believed they were sending their sons to be slaughtered for an unworthy cause. Who was right? We investigate to find out.
Without him, Caesar would have stood alone. He's the one who gives his body as a weapon of the war. And without him, all this killing can't go on. He's the universal soldier, and he really is to blame. His orders come from far away no more. They come from him and you and me. And brothers, can't you see? This is not the way we put an end to war.
To learn more about the Vietnam War, we contacted Vietnam veteran Jerry Ionelli, Steve Kravick's uncle.
How did you feel about being drafted?
Well, I was really too young and uneducated to worry about the war very much. I thought I was just going into the Army, not to Vietnam.
You know, they could be drafted and be sent overseas to some unknown place to fight and possibly die for something they didn't believe in. You know, most of your white middle class, upper middle class kids, unless you wanted to join ROTC or get involved in an officer's level, you did. Otherwise, you were drafted.
If you didn't have a college deferment, you were immediately drafted into the Army.
What was your view of the government at the time of the war?
I wish the government was more committed to winning the war and had been more aggressive against the enemy.
It was something we should never have really gotten involved in. And if you look at it, supposedly Bobby Kennedy or JFK or other people would have gotten out of there, and suddenly you escalated, you got 500,000 men in there, you know, it was a mess.
Please describe your experiences in Vietnam.
Actually, I was lucky, and I made out quite well. I was promoted to sergeant prior to going over to Nam, so that really made a difference in my work assignments. I was actually assigned to a gun truck. We provided protection for the convoys that carried the food and the fuel on the highways.
Now people have a different attitude towards kids coming back from Afghanistan or Iraq. And unfortunately then, you're right, there was not, people weren't welcome home, so a lot of, you know, the soldiers, the kids who were coming back were, you know, burning their uniform and, you know, feeling bad, pretending they weren't a soldier. And
You get in the middle of this highly emotional situation, and you know, your buddies who you're there to die for, they get hurt, and you act irrationally and start taking out women and children who are innocent.
You're put in a situation of kill or get killed. You're nervous anyway. You don't know who the enemy is. Suddenly you have a little old lady or a young kid throwing a grenade at you. Something happens, shots are fired, things get out of control.
Have you ever felt that your country did not support your struggle in Vietnam?
Well, I felt they could have done more to help in the returning vets. We came back, especially those who were wounded, and also their families.
And what kind of welcome did you receive upon returning from Vietnam?
Well, my friends and family were glad to see me return, but I don't think the country really cared that much. I received in the mail a certificate from President Nixon thanking me for my service, but not much.
What did you miss most about the United States during your tour?
Now, I think many of the things we just take for granted, and certain foods, just going out safely in public, just driving a car, being able to vote, going to school, freedom to worship, things like that.
If you join the service, you follow orders at any cost. You give up your decision-making ability about what's right and wrong.
Did your feelings on the conflict change during your tour?
Not really. I was just concerned with being careful, and I actually counted the days until I could return back to the United States.
I don't hold individual soldiers responsible.
Of course not. They were just pawns in a game, you know.
Oh, I'm just a typical American boy from a typical American town. I believe in God and Senator Dodd, and I keep an old Castro down.
I still haven't heard anybody justify all the loss of lives. You have to have a really good reason to sacrifice young lives. The people rising up and saying this isn't right, and to not protest would have been wrong. I think it really mattered to get as many people standing up and saying this isn't right, this doesn't make sense, we can't do this.
Do you think that the demonstrations had an impact upon how the war was conducted?
Not at all. The military leaders had their ideas of what they wanted the military to do, and they did it.
There were times when I would be at demonstrations and the pro-war demonstrators would be almost as great in number as the anti-war demonstrators, and yet we were organized, they weren't.
You had to not think or feel to take a stand. Very few people took a stand for the war that I knew. People need.
I saw, the police riot in Chicago. I saw a police riot in New York. When I say a police riot, I mean police going crazy. During the May Day demonstrations in 1971, where they just started arresting anybody who had long hair or a mini skirt on at that time, where they ran out of space in regard to jails, and they had to start using Robert F. Kennedy Stadium. They arrested so many people, they had to put them into a stadium when we would have to face the National Guard. The demonstrators would have to face the National Guard, who were militarily trained and had bayonets and had full automatic weaponry.
When did you first learn about the anti-war demonstrations going on?
It actually was when I was in Vietnam.
What was your reaction to the demonstrations?
I was really somewhat disappointed initially that the people back home were not supporting us and supporting the troops.
And what impact did the demonstrations have on you?
Well, later on, I realized that the demonstrators were just concerned with ending the war and stopping the U.S. soldiers from being killed or wounded.
And have you ever been criticized for your participation in the war by anti-war activists?
No, I haven't.
A lot of the media, press, and politicians tried to paint the demonstrators as a lunatic fringe bent on violence. Veterans who returned home formed an organization called VVAW, Vietnam Veterans Against the War. And you'll still see their presence very much at the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. You'll still see so many of the veterans who returned were completely fed up with the war, with what they had to go through, with the Army, with the military.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome.
I mean, look at us with the drones right now. How dare we send planes in there, empty planes in there to go strafe, Al-Qaeda, but you get the women and the children who are totally innocent.
I don't think that our government gets as foolishly involved in wars as they once did, or in other governments' affairs as they once did, where it virtually ignored the wishes of many of its citizens.
When I went down to D.C. and saw the wall, and you start seeing the names, and they had a moving wall in Holliston where I lived, and when I started trying to look up my friend's name, and I looked through all these towns in Massachusetts, and all the kids were 18, 19, 20 years old.
The Union is behind us, we shall not be moved. The Union is behind us, we shall not be moved. Just like a tree that's standing by the water.